In 2008, people from Chad, a country in Central Africa, only had a life expectancy of 47 years. At that same time, people from New Zealand had a life expectancy of 80 years. Now, it can be expected, with such differences in life expectancy between these two countries, there would also be differences in the age that women have their first child. A 2008 study by Lowe and colleagues analysed 170 nations' birth and death records. As life expectancy increased, so did the average age women first became mothers. So what does all of this have to do with evolutionary psychology? Well, life history theorists argue that as all organisms, including humans, have a limited amount of energy at our disposal, we must each make a trade-off of how to expend that energy. The strategy an organism adopts depends on how one can increase their fitness to best suit their specific environment. An unstable and harsh environment leads to the adoption of a fast strategy of development. But why? Well, in risky environments with high mortality, individuals who mature and reproduce earlier are likely to have greater reproductive success than those who reproduce later, as they are less likely to die before having the opportunity to reproduce. Several researchers have found support for this theory in animals and humans. For example, individual differences in life history strategies of perch have been found to be influenced by environmental factors such as the presence of predators and the density of competition. Given this evidence of individual differences, the question arises, are there specific factors which influence the adoption of a fast strategy, and are there consequences to the adoption of a fast life strategy? Before addressing these questions, I'd like to point to some research that found that exposure to a chemical in childhood reduced life expectancy by 20 years by inhibiting and disrupting the immune and hormonal systems, while also impacting brain development. As exposure increased, so did the consequences. High doses led to triple the risk of developing lung cancer and double the risk of developing coronary heart disease. It also led to an increased risk of developing autoimmune diseases like type 1 diabetes and rheumatoid arthritis. Now, I've got to be honest, this research conducted by the CDC in the late 90s wasn't evaluating exposure to a chemical, but instead childhood exposure to trauma. Now, what do I mean by trauma? Physical, sexual, emotional abuse, neglect, exposure to domestic violence, substance abuse within the household, and parental separation and divorce. This research, the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs study, used data from over 17,000 participants and found that exposure to trauma was widespread, with over 2/3 of participants having experienced one or more traumatic experience in childhood, and 1 in 8 experiencing 4 or more traumatic events. The consequences: higher rates of suicide, obesity, substance abuse, employment instability, and marital breakdowns. Now, there was a dose-response relationship. As the ACEs increased, so did the consequences. With those experiencing 4 or more traumatic events, their risk of suicide was 12 times greater than those who had not experienced trauma. This tells us that traumatic events in childhood increases the risk of largely preventable diseases, reduce life expectancy by 20 years, and leads individuals to more maladaptive behaviours. But how does this relate to life history theory? A longitudinal study by James and colleagues found that high levels of ecological stress in childhood led to earlier sexual maturity, earlier sexual debut, and greater risk-taking in adulthood. So you might be wondering, exactly how does trauma lead to greater risk-taking? Now, remember how organisms develop life history strategies to best suit their environment? Well, both a fast and slow strategy have consequences. Each is like a double-edged sword. A strategy may increase one's reproductive success, but it may also lead to maladaptive behaviours. Two specific hormonal changes associated with trauma are changes to serotonin and cortisol. For serotonin, a consequence of early life stress is the dysregulation of serotonergic receptors. Reduced serotonin plays a large role in symptoms of anxiety, depression, and to some degree ADHD. But also, low levels of serotonin are associated with greater impulsivity and emotional dysregulation. The consequences being a reduced ability to delay gratification. In other words, a lack of self-control. This lack of self-control means a greater likelihood to behave in a risky manner, including greater drug and alcohol use and abuse and binge eating, among many other things. For cortisol, the stress hormone, as can be expected, the greater someone's exposure to trauma, the higher their cortisol levels will be. But what are the consequences of this? There are many, but in particular, sustained high levels of cortisol can lead to an inhibited immune system, which can further explain the greater risk for certain diseases. But also, chronic high levels of cortisol within childhood lead to an oversensitive amygdala, the part of the brain that activates the fight or flight response. An oversensitive amygdala means repeated activation of the sympathetic nervous system for even the mildest of threats, which can further suppress the immune system and may also partly explain the observed increased risk of certain diseases from exposure to ACEs. Now, I've discussed many topics, but the key takeaway is that natural selection has driven organisms to adopt strategies that increase one's fitness to best suit their environment, bearing in mind that these strategies come with far-reaching consequences. So most importantly, instead of viewing maladaptive behaviors like drug and alcohol abuse, sexual promiscuity, and theft as a characterological trait or an individual fault, we should see them as responses to one's ecology. This will enable us to address the problem, not just the symptom. We need to put out the source, not just the spot fires. Thank you.